Welcome, everybody. This is day 2 of the symposium, Artworks, Teaching Labor and Capitalism in Art and Design. We had amazing panels with engaged audiences yesterday. Thank you so much for sharing your professional experience with us. I hope you also participate throughout the panel in the chat box. I saved all these conversations and they will be available after the symposium. Let me introduce myself. My name is Kyung-hee Pyun. I'm a co-host of the symposium with Dan Levinson-Wilk. As professors at FIT, Dan teaches American history in the Department of Social Sciences. I teach art history in the Department of History of Art. The symposium is a component of our 3-year research project called Teaching Business and Labor History to Art and Design Students. FIT received its first grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2018. We thank taxpayers like you. We thanked many people who supported and participated in this project yesterday. Today, I want to thank some more people, including our assistants. Dan and I are tremendously fortunate to have talented, thoughtful, and enormously collegiate colleagues in our own departments. My chair 3 years ago, when I started this project, was David Drogin, art historian of the Renaissance culture. He was always supportive of my new imaginative plans and made them materialized. Thank you, David. He's taking his sabbatical leave. My new chairperson now is Justin DeYoung, an amazing scholar of fashion history of 19th century Paris. Her digital humanities project, Fashion History Timeline, will be cross-referenced in our website, businesshistory.fitnyc.edu. My colleagues, Amy Wobel, expert of American art and history of censorship, provided insights and guides for us. Andrew Weinstein, who teaches modern and contemporary art, is a great example of incorporating business and labor history in our history surveys, such as history of industrial design or theories of Western art. Both shared their pedagogical visions with the faculty fellows during our project. Dan also had supportive colleagues. We thank Paul Clement, the chairperson of social sciences. Some of other faculty members from social sciences are in fact participating as a panelist today. You will see some of them this afternoon. And Dan and I acknowledge that visual resources curator Molly Shen and technologist Adria Nanjasen in the School of Liberal Arts, also in the Department of History of Art, helped us with the essential tools when we were creating our website or presenting at numerous conferences. Thank you so much, Molly and Nanja. We always went to them with last-minute requests. And we personally thank Professor Joseph Anderson, Digital Initiatives Librarian in the Marcus Gladys Library, for building and maintaining our project website. Finally, we thank our student assistants, Robin Lynch and India Adolfson. You saw them yesterday. I met Robin 3 years ago, and now she's graduating in May. I will miss her so much. We also have other student monitors throughout the symposium. They are Xin Lien, Paige Johnston, Joanne Shi, Ria Bias. Thank you all for showing up early and staying for 10 hours with us on both days. Without further ado, we will share some notes on the format of the symposium, and then we'll take over.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a brief note or two. We are going to have a bunch of fascinating panels, and we want our audience to participate, but we're not going to let you turn your mics on. So if you have a comment or a question, please put it in the chat box. Make sure that your chat is being delivered to everyone so that we can all see it, unless you want to message someone privately, which is okay too. And in the periods in between our sessions, we have networking breakout rooms. So feel free to go to one of those rooms. Feel free also to suggest a topic of conversation that you'd like to raise in one of those rooms. For the session directly after this one, I'm going to be going to the Bronx to hear more about Jeff Madoff's new book. So everybody to join us then. I'll announce that again at the end of the panel. And I think those are all of the announcements I have. So David, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to be here and to chair the panel, and for all of your and Kyunki's incredible organizational efforts. I've been enjoying the conference very much from what I heard yesterday, and happy to start with this morning's session. So our discussion today is about pedagogy and business and labor history, specifically for design students. And the topic is of particular interest to me, and I thought I would start with a small anecdote in terms of my own teaching. And then what I want to do is I want to introduce the panelists, pose a question, have them answer the question, hopefully start a conversation, and then have people chime in via chat with other questions. But of course, pedagogy is about teaching. At this point, pretty much every semester when I'm teaching at Parsons, I teach a course called Theorizing Luxury. And inevitably, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of between 15 and 20 graduate students who take this course every semester. And inevitably, there is a certain point over the course of the first session when that class meets, when I have to explain to one student that this is not a how-to luxury class. It's more of a discussion about some of the ethics and the concerns that come to the fore, especially in terms of labor issues when it comes to the idea of how we think about the notion of luxury, either in terms of designed objects or designed experiences. And really breaking through that barrier in terms of the idea of producing design, making luxury, making the experience of luxury, versus the notion of who's actually producing, making that luxury, not just designing, but physically putting that luxury together, whether it be an experience or an object, is often, I have found, a very difficult thing to explain, that there's a difference in this, and that there's an importance in terms of thinking about some of the larger issues when it comes to the ethics of luxury. You could think about obvious issues in relation to social justice and inequity, which of course surround the production of luxury design. And one of the things I've always struggled with and continue to struggle with is getting students to start thinking about some of these issues in a different way. And so what I'm hoping some of the panelists can shed light on is how they think about the pedagogy of business and labor, either from a historic perspective, which is in the title of our session, or from a contemporary perspective. I think I would be very excited to hear experiences in either period, the past or the present. And so one of the things that I want the panelists to begin with in terms of answering is some of their own pedagogy towards these questions of how it is that you teach business and labor to your own students. But before we jump in and hear from the panelists, I want to introduce the four panelists that are here today. The first is Shana Agid, who's an artist, designer, teacher, and activist, whose work focuses on the relationships of power and difference in visual, social, and political cultures. She is an associate professor of arts, media, and communication at Parsons School of Design, as well as the current dean of the School of Art, Media, and Technology, and a co-developer of Working with People, a keyword-based curriculum and website for developing critical pedagogical frameworks for collaborative practices, which can be found at working-with-people.org. Thank you for being here, Shana. Christina Gomez is a professor and chair of the Liberal Arts Department at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. Her research focuses on racial identity construction in the United States, skin color discrimination, immigration, and undocumented college students. She is the author of numerous articles and 2 edited books, Mi Voz, Mi Vida, Latino College Students Tell Their Life Stories from 2007, a book of essays written by students growing up Latino in this country, and Mixed from 2014, a book about identifying as multiracial. Adam Mack is an associate professor in the liberal arts department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago as well. We have excellent Chicago representation here today. He teaches courses in U.S. and transnational history with an emphasis on the social and cultural history of sensory perception. His first book, Sensing Chicago, explored the sensory landscape of industrial Chicago, its sights, sounds, smells, and tastes. He is currently working on a multisensory history of post-World War II suburbs, focusing on Park Forest, Illinois, the setting for the sociologist William White's 1956 very important bestseller, The Organization Man. And finally, Jeff Madoff began his career as a fashion designer. He was chosen as one of the top 10 designers in the US. He switched careers to film and video production. He directed award-winning commercials, documentaries, and web content for clients such as Ralph Lauren, Victoria's Secret, and Tiffany. He also works with private equity firms and investment banks such as Lazard to create the brand story for companies that are being sold as startups, looking to attract investment. And his book, Creative Careers: Making a Living with Your Ideas, is an Amazon bestseller, which is based in part on classes that he teaches at Parsons School of Design. So to start out, in terms of thinking about some of these pedagogical questions, Shana, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. Thank you so much, David, and thanks everyone for being here today. I think one of the, I'll start really briefly, which is just to say that I think about this in a couple of different ways. I think the way that Parsons is organized, many faculty end up in positions of leadership and just as part of the work that we do. And one of the things that I have done over the last 5 or 6 years is work a lot in our first year program. And a lot of students come in with an idea of what it will be to be a designer that usually is tied to notions of sort of industry in the abstract, but not labor in the concrete or sort of material thinking in the concrete. And so to me, one of the really sort of compelling pedagogical questions here is how do we actually engage students in thinking about the relational components of what design is, right? How are we thinking about the ways in which both structures of power, but also sort of histories of the movement of people and materials, the histories of labor that are actually deeply, deeply tied to design, how those things are sort of fundamental to actually understanding the fields that they might be going into and to creating sort of the capacity to imagine those fields as things that are changing or changeable. So I think in my own teaching practice, one of the things that I really focus on is actually trying to make visible, and this actually builds on some of David's work, but make visible some of the ways in which the assumptions that designers make about how you make well-designed things tends to create the requirement to make certain people invisible, whether that's laborers who produce that design, whether it's I'm in service design, right? So there's a real focus on customers and consumers, but often an absolute erasure of the other people who are involved in producing that one experience. So I think to me, one of the primary questions is how do we get students actively engaging in shifting those power dynamics in deep and material ways, right? So not just considering the voice of the worker, but rather what does it look like to design a service around a worker rather than around a customer, for instance.
Great, thank you for those comments. And Christina?
Yeah, I completely agree with Shana. And because many of the students that we teach, right, are going to be first and second year students, in my case, and they're all going to be studio artists. So they take liberal arts courses really as part of their curriculum. And so I really think a lot about what at this moment they don't know and how to expand that. So like Shana was saying, I start really with themselves. And I have them, and it sounds very basic, but I'm always surprised that students don't know this. What does it cost to live, right? an assignment that I build is let's pretend you've graduated, right? And you have to live on your own in Chicago, in New York, in LA. And what is that going to cost you? And so I have them do a full out budget on what they think they need to exist. And I have them look up apartment prices and what it costs to run their computer and the internet and food. I actually have them go to the grocery store and price out like what it will cost for them to eat. Like, what does a gallon of milk cost? Um, and I'm always, and it seems very basic, but I'm always surprised how, first of all, they don't know that. Some of them do, there's exceptions, but the majority of them don't really understand. Many of them don't even know how much money their parents might make and what it costs to live. I also have them think about what are the wages they may get at various jobs. And then depending on the year, I'll assign them an actual job. So they have to look up what the median wage is for that employment. And then, right, I think they're always shocked at how much money they're going to need. And then there's also taxes, like the difference between what they actually get in their check, what Social Security taxes might be, why they're taxed this way, and what they actually then have to live. The second assignment later on in the term is now they're going to hire workers for them for the work that they're doing, whether as fashion designers, as design object people, etc. And then what are they going to pay their workers? And have them really debate that. And then I complicate it. And then I say, let's pretend you have 2 children at home. What are you going to pay for daycare? How are you going to pay the workers who are doing the work for you at home, taking care of children, right? All the outsourcing that we may have to do in our lives. And I think that always stuns them. First of all, how little money they actually have. But secondly, a big discussion on how much do you pay your workers? What kind of benefits do you give them? Do you give your housekeeper or the person who's taking care of your children time off, paid time off? What about health insurance for them, et cetera? And inevitably, the discussions we have are really intense, deep, and there's big arguments that someone says, like, if I'm making only 40,000, I can't pay my housekeeper $20 an hour or $15 an hour. I'm going to have to pay them below minimum wage in order to make this work, or I don't have that. And so I think it's a way of making this very personal for them, but making them think about what it costs, starting with them, but then moving to issues of labor for how, when they become artists, when they have to pay individuals, as Shana said, what if we center that around them and what they need? So
that's really interesting. Adam?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for that generous introduction, David, which I wrote. And I just wanted to begin by saying that I think one issue that I've noticed recently in teaching is that more and more of our students are interested in something like a social practice. The students, I teach history, and the students come to class and they want to know about the connections between the past and the present. They want what we're doing in class to kind of speak to now. And so what I did in the summer of 2020, following the Black Lives Matter protests and the George Floyd case, was I developed a class to speak to those issues in Chicago. And so I developed a class on violence in Chicago is the title. It's an upper level seminar. It's mostly a history class. About a third of the class deals with kind of present day circumstances in terms of police violence and neighborhood violence. In terms of dealing with business and labor history, I found that there actually were quite a few connections. For instance, we talked about the violence that stemmed from residential segregation and the real estate business. I found that these discussions were especially rich when it came to labor history, when we got to issues of commemoration and memorials and public memory. And so I developed a sort of a set of assignments to help students engage with those issues alongside the city of Chicago, which is currently looking over its memorial landscape and making recommendations for changes. And I developed a series of assignments to help the students participate in that debate about monuments and public memory and memorials. I'm happy to talk about them. In short, I had them propose their own memorial for the city using the same format and approach that would be required if they were actually officially requesting a memorial. That is, they use the form provided by the city's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. And then we get into the details of just how complicated and expensive it is to build a new memorial. So I'm happy to talk more about how those discussions relate to labor and so on as we proceed.
Great. Jeffrey?
So I teach a course called Creativity, Making a Living with Your Ideas. And one of the things that I talk about with the students, and it relates to what Christina was talking about, is context. Because you're hoping to do your job in the real world. That means that there are costs involved in doing your job. And I think that oftentimes the practical aspects of creativity and trying to make a living with your creativity are overlooked. One of the stories I tell my students every semester is about kind of a bad movie, but it's fun to watch, which is called Enter the Dragon. It stars Bruce Lee, if anybody's seen it. And yeah, cool movie. The fight scenes are cool. But there's a moment in there that I think is one of the great lines. And that is that Bruce's nemesis holds a board right up next to Bruce's face. And he then breaks the board. Bruce doesn't blink. And he looks back at the guy and says, "Boards don't hit back." And I love that because life hits back. And we don't learn or teach the students how to deal with the difficulties they're going to have, not just the contextual difficulties of where you're going to live, how much is it going to cost, how are you going to get to work, how much is that going to cost, and all the things that Christina was talking about, but also dealing with the personalities that they're inevitably going to have to deal with during their professional journey. And I also think that creativity has a very old definition. And most people think about creativity that, well, they're going to be a designer or they're going to be an actor, musician, writer, whatever. But also entrepreneurship, I believe, is a creative act. And that means that there is an idea that you're trying to actualize. And in actualizing that idea, that's a creative act because that's what creativity is. So I think that context is really important. I think that understanding what creativity is very important, and how you're going to interact with the world, which then does bring in labor, does bring in ethical questions and all of those things. But I see them not as siloed. I see them all very much working together in terms of trying to understand the world that you hope to function in, because otherwise you can't really help define any of the other aspects in terms of making a living, which is why all of these students are going to school and pursuing what they're pursuing. And I'll add one other thing to that, which is, I think, germane to our audience and the students that we teach. If you're going to be a dentist, an accountant, a lawyer, a doctor, nobody says to you, what's your fallback position? But if you're going to be a designer, if you're going to be an actor or anyone in the arts, that's the first question that's asked. What's your fallback position? That tells us something culturally about how we look at creativity and how limited our view is, and how somehow it's more of an aberration than actually an avocation. And so my interest in teaching is helping students find their creative voice, which I think is important through all aspects of business, and even in how you deal with labor and how you are inclusive in terms of what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that this idea of thinking about, and also just looking at the comments that people are making, thinking about this idea about creativity, but also the pragmatic aspects of creativity, right? So I love, Jeffrey, that you're asking students to think about the value of their creativity, but also how society contextualizes creativity. And Christina, your idea of creating a budget, I think, is fabulous because it gets students to think about the decisions that they're going to have to make as individuals with capital, right, in terms of how they're going to be spending that money on themselves and others. I think it's also interesting that you include things like that they're going to have to hire people, pay people, and what does that mean ethically? but how that also becomes contextualized and also in a lot of ways problematized by what it is that they're doing in terms of career choices. Adam, can you talk a little bit more about the Chicago Monuments project? And after that, Shana, I also would love to hear more about the Working with People project, because I want to hear some more about these practical everyday practices that you could bring, or that we could bring into the classroom.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. And so Chicago's mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who was fairly recently elected, Christina can remind me exactly when that was, 2 years ago, put together a commission to study monuments across the city. It's called the Chicago Monuments Project. They have a website. It looks like Dan may have posted the link on chat. Thank you very much for that, Dan. And I urge you to take a look at the website. It's really very well done. When we when I raise the issue of monuments in the class, we sort of work alongside this website in the sense which is cataloging and evaluating memorials across Chicago. We kind of work alongside it, as I said, to raise basic but really complex questions about what it takes to not only kind of propose, but to realize a monument or a memorial in the city of Chicago. I found that one thing and this, by the way, is even for a figure who people roundly agree should be memorialized. It is still really complicated to get a memorial approved and realized. And one thing that I found that students were so surprised about was the expense. For instance, there's currently an effort in Chicago to build an Ida B. Wells memorial, and one of the main hangups is fundraising. They just haven't been able to raise the money for the sculpture yet. And so this is one of those kind of issues that's sort of very surprising to students. They're surprised that they have to navigate a complex bureaucracy. They're surprised that they have to raise quite a bit of money. And then when we start getting at debates over particular monuments, and so readings of particular monuments across the city, the students are also somewhat surprised that monuments can be difficult to design in ways that please multiple constituencies, right? In fact, that can be very, very challenging. And so we have these wonderful discussions about these questions, and then I have them, as I said, actually propose their own monument. And my thinking in terms of pedagogy is that the kind of writing that they do in this assignment using the form from the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events looks a lot like the kind of writing they'll do as artists and designers in other contexts. It is in some sense a kind of grant proposal. And so I find that the combination of a kind of professionally sort of relevant form of writing plus their own kind of burning interest in the memorial landscape today was kind of a recipe for success in that class. The students really, really got into it. And I think that, in fact, I've been inspired to design a class just on memorials and monuments, which I'll be teaching in the fall of 22 as a writing class. And we'll probably do some of the same things. I hope that answered your question, David.
Yeah, no, definitely. The specifics are helpful, and I look forward to spending some time on the website. It looks terrific. And Shana?
Yeah, thank you. I have to say, Adam, as I'm listening to you, I'm also thinking about, because I think when we met before this, you talked about the Chicago torture memorials, and I keep thinking about the ways in which, for those who don't know, there was an historic, in fact, the first ever reparations ever offered to survivors of police brutality was in Chicago due to a really, really long organizing project, one piece of which was a massive art show that was framed around the idea of proposing a memorial that would address that history of violence. And one of the memorial proposals was a piece of legislation that became this whole other thing that folks organized around, that the reparations grew out of. So it's just such an interesting kind of overlap to think about the way that that history that you're talking about sort of comes into the present and then manifests in these different kinds of things. So working with people is a project that I started with my colleague Gabrielle Bendina-Viani, who is a photographer, a designer, and a curator who works really closely with communities in New York City that are undergoing mostly change in the built environment, either through gentrification or longer sort of periods of displacement. And she and I were both in the process of teaching classes that engage students with people in the world in one way or another. So I teach a collaborative service design class, and she was teaching this city studio class, I think it was called. And we were in a series of meetings with other colleagues talking about how to prepare students to do that work, to actually work with people outside of the classroom. And one of the things that we were really struck by is that it seemed, oh, thank you, Daniel, is that it seemed like people used a lot of words that they assumed they meant the same things by, words like community or public or even ethnography. When in fact there were really stark and important differences in the ways that those words meant things to people. And so one of the things that we decided to do was to sort of start a project that was aimed less at coming up with one definition and more at actually dealing with and engaging the tensions and differences between the ways that people engage these words as itself kind of a pedagogical tool. So the result, which one day we will have time to really work on, which we've sort of strapped together with tape and glue up to now, is the website that Daniel just posted, which is a collection of essentially the goal is 1 minute or less videos of people defining or describing a series of keywords that emerged as things that got used a lot but not defined particularly thoroughly in design and education, or words that seem to be really conspicuously absent, right? Words like representation or power, things that seem to be always operating but never getting talked about. So the goal of so we wrote a curriculum that goes with it. You can also grab that off the website. But the goal of it was really to begin sort of experimenting with what does it look like if we use, say, 3 short videos in which 3 different people are talking about what they mean by community, to foster a conversation about sort of what is present in those sort of definitions, if you will, and then what's missing, right? So it allows for us in classrooms, and actually Gabrielle really interestingly has used this. I use it in class a lot, but we've also used it as teacher training tool for kind of talking about power and community in the classroom as sort of things to be engaging with. And Gabrielle really interestingly has also used it with a lot of arts organizations and even foundations to guide the ways that they're thinking about the terms, again, that they kind of, that we often find ourselves sort of throwing around, but not actually taking time to discuss. And so one of the goals of this project is really to try to, again, sort of in the context of art and design school and in design classrooms in particular, to try to make space for the idea that things are ambiguous, that things are contested, that not agreeing on something doesn't mean that we can't also find ways to work together, right? That we actually have to grapple with those disagreements in productive ways in order to do that work. And I think for Gabrielle and me, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, one of the biggest pieces of this had to do with, we would both teach these classes in which we really encouraged students to think very carefully about the positions they were coming from, whether that was as university students or as aspiring designers, and to really critique the idea that designers could sort of come into a spot and diagnose what needed to be done and come up with a solution. And what we noticed was that the result was that like halfway through the semester, students went into a complete crisis panic because they were like, we shouldn't be doing anything. We shouldn't even be here. Who are we to be, suggesting anything? So the other thing that this allowed us to do was sort of take that feeling of complexity and make it sort of an active part of the learning that was happening, right? So rather than feeling like you don't know what to do about something, meaning that you should walk away, it was more of a way of kind of actually engaging those feelings of discomfort early on and in sort of low stakes ways so that students learn how to kind of think and work through them and learn how to contest each other's sort of language or bring into the classroom different ideas of community. So one of the sort of benefits of this is that that notion of community or the notion of public, we tend to think of those tend to get used rather in design and education frameworks as sort of always sort of good, right? Like puppies and rainbows. And this allows us to actually have conversations about like what happens when you're in multiple communities and some of your communities don't see the others, right? Like what happens, so thinking, for instance, Christina, about your work on like colorism, right? Like what happens in communities where, there are always, other things are at work, and right? How do communities engage with the structural sort of systems of race or gender or sexuality? What happens if someone identifies you as being part of a community you don't actually identify with, right? How do you challenge those tensions? So I think it tends to create a kind of openness for thinking about the complexity that ought to sit next to some of the other kinds of questions that we're asking about what designers do.
Great. And please, if people have questions of any sort, to please enter them into the chat, because I think that would be great to move the conversation and to open the conversation. I love this idea, Shana, that you mentioned about discomfort. And one of the things that I'm always struck by, certainly in our classrooms at Parsons, but I think that this is not just what we see at Parsons, I think it happens in higher education all over, is the incredible differences in terms of our students, right? So I'm thinking specifically about Jeffrey, what you were talking about, and Christina, your example of creating that budget, which I keep going back to in my mind, how it is in those contexts when you talk, Jeffrey, about this notion of thinking about creativity in different ways and what entrepreneurship means in terms of what it is that the students are bringing to the classroom. I'd love to hear more about that. But before that, Christina, I would love to know what happens in your classroom in terms of economic disparity, of what students are bringing to their budget and what type of tensions and interesting conversations that creates amongst the students, which I would imagine could be quite complicated.
Well, it's amazing, right? Just for example, like, what do you think you'll pay in rent in Chicago? Students will say, like, I'm going to have an apartment that costs $2,000, right? Which in Chicago, by the way, is a lot for like a one bedroom. And someone else will be saying 600. And then the question is like, well, where are you living? And as Adam has brought up, because of the hyper segregation in Chicago, prices for various things can vary tremendously, but of course the living quality as well. I think what's also an important thing for us to grapple with, and I have to do a lot more work on this, is so many of our students are international.
Absolutely.
So the inequality of pay, right, in many places can be even greater. So if you're a designer or an artist or a fashion person in, I don't know, El Salvador or Mexico, right, versus in New York City versus India versus China, the prices that you may pay for labor will vary tremendously. And many students really are not aware of that, and why, right, the history of labor in the United States and the movement to offshoring or to doing this in other countries because of the inequality of labor, and to really do a deep dive investigation. But also in terms of kind of the history of racial discrimination in the United States and how we pay different people. When I'm really on top of this, I'll have them also look at different prices or median incomes for different racial groups, right? And many students are unaware of of what that looks like. Or articles. It's an old article called "We'd Love to Hire Them, But," and it's an article by Neckerman that interviewed employers about who they hired and why, and what they thought those employers would bring to the table, and also who they were very frank about who they can underpay and why. And again, right, something that students aren't necessarily thinking about, but they're going to be part of. And as Shana said, right, complicating what their future may look like. So I think the talks are interesting. It gets tricky because, as you say, also the differences between and among the students about the backgrounds they come from and the expectations for the lives they may live and what they're willing to pay for something can vary. Right? It's treacherous sometimes, right? People are shocked at what some people may pay for, but still, it brings up really good discussions, and I think it makes them aware also of their classmates and the different places that we come from. So,
Yeah, I always at some point during the semester focus on questions related to domestic labor, and the what students are saying depending on their background. Either the idea that people are hiring other people to work in their home is a complete anathema to some students, and then there's other students, where there's a team working in the house. And different notions about emotional relationships towards those individuals who are doing the work, or the lack of them. It is treacherous in terms of thinking about, but always leads to interesting conversations.
Let me also say, just my last point, there are also very good films that we can use. There's one called Made in the USA, MAID, right?
Yeah.
Which does a really nice overview, and we have good discussions, and also about organizing for domestic workers and what that means. And there's an organization in Chicago that we also kind of use as a background about what that would look like. There's a great movie that came out. It was, I think it was New York, El Séptimo Día. And it's about service workers, and it's about men in soccer, but it's really about service workers. And you see the background of employers hiring these Latin American, I think the Guatemalan workers and Mexican workers in Brooklyn to deliver food, and what that looks like. And so I think using those films as a backdrop helps students begin to understand more carefully, like what that life looks like, and the kind of material existence that they have. So.
Interesting. I've been made in the USA is great, and I've also been using for a number of years now a documentary called The Queen of Versailles, which I don't know if people have seen before, which is, there's a lot of, it's sort of this salacious, over the top representation of excess and conspicuous consumption, and also amidst the economic crisis of 2008, while this family is attempting to build the largest house in the United States. But a lot of it also focuses on their domestic workers, and it leads to all kinds of interesting conversations as well. Jeffrey, how about this idea about creativity and what students bring to the classroom in terms of their backgrounds?
Well, what we're talking about, I want to take a step back a moment. And what we're talking about in terms of relationship to labor and the various things that Christina and Shana brought up. I think that a fundamental question that we need to ask, and I actually ask my students this at the beginning of every semester, and I bring in a different guest every week to speak that I interview. And that is the notion of what is success. And I think the notion of what is success is a driver that affects how you relate to labor, how you relate to other people, and of course, how you relate to whatever it is you're pursuing. So I think that, there are personal questions that we need to engage the students in that is going to set up the context for their pursuits and what they're going to be doing. And I also think that there is a difference between success and fulfillment. And fulfillment is very important, especially for everybody. But, certainly if you take a more creative path, you're doing that because you have a compelling need to create. And as a result, that need is satisfied by a certain fulfillment of the process and the activity. So I think that there are personal questions that go across different cultures. At Parsons, of course, I have quite an international base of students also. But what's really interesting, and it's the old trite phrase, but people are people. And in terms of the desires, the wants, the drives, and so on, and there's a certain amount of self-selection. If you're going to FIT or in Chicago or Parsons, you're getting a particular group of people already that are selected and filtered in a certain way. But I think that these are the questions even behind the creativity, behind how you relate to labor, behind all the context, because it's your own individual psychological worldview that has, I think, a tremendous impact on how you treat others and what you think you have to do in order to be successful based on how you define it. Now, I confused myself during that answer. Did that relate to what you were talking about?
No, I thank you. I appreciate your comments. I wanted to raise a question that Dan put into the chat, which I like a lot. he says a lot of my, you can read it along with me, but a lot of my art design students have more experience working in sales and service jobs than in art and design jobs. Do any of you use your expertise in sales and service design and labor to connect students' experiences working with sales and service jobs with labor issues they will face in working future art and design jobs? You know, what is the connection between what they're currently doing, I guess, and what they may be training to be doing in the future? Any thoughts about that?
I mean, I can say something to that, which is I think that, again, these are all formative experiences. So, you know, if you are working in a sales or service job, if you have that kind of job in high school or junior high, and then you go on to college, you're going to have a certain context to place that in and a certain worldview that is still being formed. But I know that in being a salesman, you know, a shoe salesman when I was a kid and going door to door sales, that gave me a certain empathic connection to people whose job it is to do that. And then there were the service employees that worked at the store that I worked at. And again, you know, I realized because I saw these people every day that there was another empathic connection that happened with those people. So I think that everything we do informs everything else we do. And the important thing is to set up a context around that and being able to act with respect and inclusion with people. And I think that if you've been in that position, certainly one reaction can be, oh, I don't want to ever be in that position again. But hopefully one is empathic enough to realize that their journey has also impacted on your own. And then how do you use that in later life in terms of what you're doing and how you fairly treat people?
Any other thoughts about that question?
Could I add something real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I love Dan's question. One thing that it occurred to me when I read it was that there's also the kinds of jobs that students don't do. And so one of the things that I've asked students before is, has anyone worked in a factory in my classes, right? And the number of students who respond with an affirmative, I can count on one hand, right? Just the sort of lack of knowledge about what goes on in those kinds of contexts. And I tell a story about how I worked briefly at like a dairy when I was in college, and it was the hardest physical labor I've ever had to do. And I talk about the sort of ways in which workers' bodies are sort of at stake in discussions of labor, and we talk about sort of the numbing of the senses and so on. And so I wanted to make that point on Dan's question. I also just very briefly wanted to address something Jeffrey said about guest speakers. Our campus went fully on Zoom in the fall of 2020. And the one thing that I really liked about it was that I was able to invite more guest speakers to my Violence in Chicago class than I had ever invited before. I had 5 guest speakers, and I usually have 1, maybe 2. And so one of the persons I brought, I'm going to try to post a link here. There we are. Getting back to Shana's question about the Chicago Torture Justice Project, was a torture survivor who visited my class via Zoom and talked about his experiences in a really kind of moving way. It was really, I think, in some sense, the highlight of the class for the students to meet an actual torture survivor and to use those experiences to think through what a torture memorial might look like. So just a couple quick observations there.
Any other thoughts about that question?
I have just one quick one. I think, Daniel, I really, I really appreciate your question, and I feel like basically what I will do is steal that, because I don't actually think I have made that connection before, and I think it's a really important one to make, because I think, like in my collaborative service design class, one of the things we do talk a lot about is students' work experience, right? And we often joke that the world would be a better place if everyone were required to work in a restaurant for 2 years, for instance, right? And I don't, it's interesting, Adam, to think about kind of what are the forms of labor that are most likely kind of that first job that you get, kind of work in different places. around the country and around the world. And I think, to me, one of the things that we get out of talking about what people's labor experiences are, have been and are, right? Because we also have students who are working 2-3 jobs in the classroom, and who are talking about that, is that we start to, I think, again, sort of make less abstract what is actually valuable about labor, where I think there's an interesting way in which labor of many different kinds gets abstracted over and over and over again in design and design education. In my university, I teach a university lecture course, which is a wide undergraduate course on design and politics at Parsons, or at the New School. And this year, one of our colleagues, one of David's and my colleagues, Christina Moon, came and was talking about work that she does around labor in fashion production. And one of the images she showed, I just haven't forgotten since, and it was an image of some workers in a factory distressing a pair of jeans. And I think it was the first time that, of course, it occurred to me that any distressed pair of jeans has to be individually distressed. And I think that one of the things that was so striking about the image is that, to your point, Adam, we don't see images of what happens inside a factory unless we are there and working there, or unless it's fictionalized, or and so I think some of this, somebody brought up in the chat earlier the kind of having a clearer sense of ethics in terms of global chains of production, or even sort of the way that materials function in design. I think that there are these moments that those kinds of ideas sort of open up. And I think, Dan, your question points to, I think, this other idea, which is like, how do we first orient students to, I guess, in the way I would think about it, kind of critically thinking about or politicizing even their own experiences of labor, right? Their own labor, as a means not just of creating kind of empathy in a broad sense, but creating like a sense of something along the lines of either common cause, or of just a deeper understanding of how much work goes into everything we engage, just because I think so much of that is so difficult to see at this juncture. I also just wanted to say there's a question in the chat that from Joy that I think is really interesting about transitioning discussion from these complicated differences into finding common ground. And I think I just wanted to say really quickly that to me, that work starts in the first couple of weeks of a class, where we do a lot of work building, talking about what it is going to mean to engage with difference, and then build community agreements that we, in my classes, build collectively based on prompts I offer, but also what other people bring in. And I think a piece of that work is being able to have a foundation to go back to, right? So when everything feels a little bit complicated, that we're able then to actually point back to the ways in which we have already made decisions to work collectively. I also offer reading, some historical and some contemporary, from design and also from not design, about things like managing difficult conversations, or things like community organizing, so that people see sort of ways that people pull together to make things. We have a long set of conversations and a lot of practice around facilitation. And those are all ways that usually between that and having a common project that we're working on in those classes, we're able to kind of move through to be able to stay focused on the complexity of not having solutions so much, but being able to engage with complex things in ways that still result in making stuff, right? And seeing what gets made when you actually stay with that complexity. Thanks for that question. It's such a good one.
Great. And I'm glad that you mentioned Joy's question, because I agree that's an important point. And Patrice is pointing further at, which I want to highlight again, of your example of watching the distressing occur. I mean, there's levels of irony to that you're unaware of the labor that goes into the individual distressing of the garment. And of course, people are buying the distressed garment in a way because it signals this notion of, this is the pair of denim that actually has been worn while labor has occurred to distress it in the first point. I mean, it's such a, I have to get that picture from Christina. That sounds like a great, helpful pedagogical tool, which would help in my own classes.
Well, David, look at the breadth of the population that is, and these are kids too, that are paying to have somebody else wear out their jeans. I mean, that's
No,
pretty weird when you think about it.
it's a very and another very bizarre aspect
Yes.
of the commodity fetish, right?
Can I tell a real quick story one about that? I was
Please.
watching an episode of 60 Minutes years ago, and it was a segment on a very expensive wrinkled T-shirt. You bought the T-shirt pre-wrinkled, and the correspondent asked the salesperson why the shirt was so expensive, and the salesperson said, because the wrinkles don't come out.
It's amazing. It's yeah. I'm doing I'm working on a project related to leisure actually at the moment. The putative opposite of labor, even though I don't think that it's the opposite at all. And part of the leisure that I'm looking at is collectors and watch collecting. And there is a enormous interest in this in terms of watches that have what are called a tropical dial, right? Which is this kind of weared out vintage appearance that happens with a particular type of sun exposure. And people will go on and on about these objects because they appear a certain way. But that patina, right? Whether it be the distressed denim or the wrinkled T-shirt or the tropical watch dial, I mean, all of these things that, to Jeffrey, your point, that a lot of people are willing to pay a lot of money for, is endlessly fascinating. Endlessly. So I'm aware that it's 9:57, and that I think that we have a hard stop at 10 o'clock. Are there any final comments that anybody on the panel wanted to make or us to think about? I see that Patrice also has this comment about an opportunity for class discussions about different points of view in terms of issues related to labor rights, health, and safety. And I think that's also something, of course, to think about when it comes to the idea of actually talking about labor and talking about students' understanding of what is required in that, and what you were describing just in terms of the sheer paucity of students who have actually had experience of working on a factory floor. It's interesting, to think about where students are coming from in terms of their backgrounds and lack of experiences in terms of these things, and as we move forward. But any other final thoughts?
Can I just add, I think one of the things that's it's distressing is that when you see this on a macro level, you think of the maquiladoras on the border, just as an example of Mexico and the United States, and what happens when labor, right, becomes funneled very specifically to hiring a certain type of person because they're so exploitable. In this case, young women, often indigenous or Mexican, and then what happens to the whole city, right? So the femicide that we've seen in those areas, the killing of young women,
Yeah.
and the violence that's occurred, and the shanty towns, right? And the 24-hour workspace that occurs. So you have people coming in at 2 in the morning and exiting at 8, and to keep the factories open. It's something that I think, right, the students should be exposed to, and to think about how labor, when on a macro level, what happens then. And I think there's a lot of information that we can use for students, so both at the individual, but then something greater.
Great. No, I think that that's an excellent point to end our discussion on. How do we go to you want to tell people how to go to the breakout room?
Sure.
And thank you all very much as well. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. I am going to head with Jeff to the Bronx room. If you go back to the program, you'll see there's networking discussion lines, and one of the links is for the Bronx. Come with me there if you'd like to talk about Jeff's book. I also know that we didn't really get a chance to talk about Jackie's question about entrepreneurship as creativity. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in the Bronx. Jackie wants to join us there. It's all in the program. Come back in half an hour to the main room for what every art and design student should know about the history of racial discrimination. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Hope to see you in a few minutes.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.